A couple of weeks ago, researchers from MIT published a paper titled Your Brain on ChatGPT. It got a ton of coverage in the popular press, and it was exactly as you'd expect. This was the paper that everyone was waiting for to confirm their opinion that AI and ChatGPT are rotting everyone's brains. But before we even look at the coverage or what's in the paper, you have to pay attention to how the title of the paper itself primes the reader into a particular position. The history here is that back in the 80s and 90s, there was a heavily played series of public service announcements to discourage people from taking drugs, and they were titled Your Brain on Drugs. This is your brain on drugs. That's where the phrase your brain on X comes from. And if you were growing up around the time, you're going to associate that phrase with what drugs do to your brain. So I'll play a couple because they are pretty evocative. Here's the first one.
This is your brain. And this is heroin. This is what happens to your brain after snorting heroin. And this.
And here's the other one.
Okay, last time. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
So that is the kind of messaging and imagery the authors are trying to evoke with even the title of the paper. And the coverage was exactly as you would expect it to be. Cognitive decline. Is ChatGPT making us dumb? Maybe eroding critical thinking. Cognitive decline. And this goes all the way to YouTube. Here is Sabina Hossenfelder.
Every time I use ChatGPT, I feel a little bit dumber.
And this is Matt Berman's thumbnail, and this is how his video on the topic starts. Well, not to mention the title, is ChatGPT making you dumb?
It turns out ChatGPT might actually be making us dumber, and I am coping hard.
I don't mean to pick on Berman and Hossenfelder. They're both great channels. I love their content. But I think they fell hard for this trap. And the authors themselves are now trying to backtrack hard from this kind of messaging. So here's one interview.
Does your study provide evidence that ChatGPT is making us dumber?
No. I'm so happy you asked, and you can see my excitement, I guess. We have like a huge FAQ on website right now.
And to their credit, they do have an FAQ. The first question on which is it safe to say that LLMs are making us dumber? And they say, no, please do not use words like stupid, dumb, brain rot, harm, damage. But of course, the coverage is already out there. This isn't going to change the messaging that's already out there. Now, full disclosure on my personal biases. If you read my blog, see the videos on my channel, I myself am very excited about the positive impact that AI can have on learning and teaching and our lives in general. I'm employed by an AI startup. So those are all my kind of personal biases going into this critique of the paper. So make of that what you will. I hope you can evaluate the critique on its own. But let's quickly look at what the paper itself studied. What they basically did was recruit a few students for an essay writing task. They were bundled into three groups: a group that used LLMs to help them write the essay, another one that only used good old search engines, and finally a third group which only used their brains. So no search engines, no LLMs. the twist was that after writing the essays, they had a session where they switched these groups. They had one group that they call LLM to Brain, which was the group that used LLMs to write the essay and then had to switch to using just their brains. And another one that did the opposite, that used their brains to write the essay, but then had to switch to using LLMs. And throughout the study, they were using EEGs to record the brain activity of the participants. And their headline finding was that the brain-only group had the strongest EEG signals, whereas the LLM-assisted group had the weakest ones. They also did a bunch of interviews with the participants. The LLM group reported low ownership, so to speak, of their writing. And when quizzed about the essay that they had written, they were often unable to quote what was in the essay. However, in terms of the essay itself, it was scored highly by both human and LLM evaluators. The essay is written by the LLM group, that is. And so the main finding out of all of this is that on an essay writing task, if you use tools like an LLM that help you a lot with writing that essay, you are going to exert less cognitive effort. You're going to have less brain activity if the tool is doing a lot of the work for you. My main disagreement with the paper is that the task itself is too narrow and doesn't look at the way in which the AI is used. And also, I don't think the authors do enough justice to the now growing body of literature, which is pointing out fairly positive effects on pedagogical activities. So ways in which AI and LLMs are used for teaching and learning. Some of these I've made videos on before, I've covered on the channel. For example, there was this meta-analysis of a lot of studies published in Nature, and they found that ChatGPT has a large positive impact on learning performance and a moderate positive impact on learning perception. And again, to stress that the way in which you use AI is very important. You need the appropriate learning scaffolds. And the way in which you integrate AI into the learning process is important. So you can't just use a raw LLM or just use the LLM straight away to solve problems for you. There's other papers that look at AI tutors that report large learning gains for students that use AI tutors as opposed to human tutors who are not easy to get in the first place. That's from this paper of using AI tutors in a real course classroom setting. And there have been other folks who have critiqued this paper and tried to explain away some of the sensationalist coverage that this paper got. Ethan Mollick, who really does a lot of great work and coverage of how AI is used for learning and teaching in schools and colleges, wrote this post on LinkedIn. This paper is being massively misinterpreted as AI hurts your brain. The students were unsurprisingly less engaged with the essay they wrote because that's the way the task was set up. But then he also calls out an interesting methodology error, which is that this line from the abstract is misleading. Over 4 months, LLM users consistently underperformed. The study does not test LLM users over 4 months. It tests 9 or so people who had the LLM help them write an essay 4 months later. This, by the way, is another common critique which many people have pointed out, that the number of participants is really low. And by the time you get to that last group, you're only left with about 9 participants. They have to be used properly to be effective AI, that is. We know from well-powered randomized controlled studies that just having the AI give you answers lowers test scores. So this is what I was talking about a bit earlier, which is that the way in which AI is used, how you integrate it into the learning and teaching processes is very important. And if done properly, there have been studies that actually show positive effects from using AI. Like he says over here, this doesn't mean that LLMs rot your brain. David Swisher over on LinkedIn also has a more in-depth critique, which I will link to below, calling out the sample size, the way the study was set up with a 20-minute time limit for the participants to write this essay, no baseline measurement, and kind of the limited setting of the study. And to the author's credit, they have a section on limitations in their paper in which they point out some of these limitations. But I think the larger point I'm trying to make is that this study was just presented and framed in such a provocative way that it completely overshadowed the main message. And I think it ended up muddying the waters rather than adding clarity to this actually very important question of what are the right ways in which to use AI in pedagogical settings. All right, I hope you found that helpful. Thanks.